Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a chapter of history that might surprise some folks with its sheer scale and, well, its impact, the Barbary slave trade.
Yeah.
We've gathered quite a bit of information, mainly drawing from a pretty detailed Wikipedia article, and our goal is really just to unpack the crucial parts of this often maybe overlooked story.
Exactly. And when we say the Barbary slave trade, we're talking about the capture and the sale of European slaves
Right.
by pirates, basically operating from what were largely autonomous Ottoman places along the North African coast, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, those areas.
And these Barbary corsairs, maybe we should quickly touch on that term.
Sure.
Think of them kind of like state-sponsored pirates,
Right.
maybe? Though how much actual state control there was, that varied quite a bit over time.
It did.
But their reach wasn't just, a small part of the Mediterranean.
No, not at all.
Their raids went from Italy all the way up the Atlantic coast, Spain, Portugal, Ireland, even as far north as Iceland.
Iceland, yeah. And it wasn't just the Western Med either. Piracy was still a big deal in the Ottoman Eastern Mediterranean, even into the 18th century.
So our main focus for this deep dive is going to be primarily from the 16th century up to the early 19th century.
Right, that's the peak period.
That's when it was really at its height. It starts to trail off in the 1800s, kind of winding down by the 1830s after the Barbary Wars, and then the French moving into the region.
Yeah, the French conquest of Algeria was a big factor there.
And who are the people actually getting caught up in this? I mean, sailors taken from ships, obviously.
Definitely a prime target.
But the raids also hit coastal towns, fishermen, villagers, people taken right from their homes.
Yeah, and it's interesting, a huge number of these enslaved people were from the Mediterranean itself. Italians especially were a very large group among the captives.
So let's try and get a handle on the numbers, the extent of this.
Okay. Well, in the 17th century, observers at the time estimated maybe around 35,000 European slaves held across Tripoli, Tunis, and mostly in Algiers.
Algiers was the main hub then.
Yeah, definitely the biggest center. And while, English sailors were noticeable, it's important to remember that the Italians probably made up the majority back then.
It really makes you think about just the human costs, the fear along those coastlines.
Absolutely. Widespread fear.
And then you get these bigger estimates. Robert Davis, he put forward a figure. It's pretty striking.
Yeah, Davis's work suggests between the early 1500s and maybe the mid-1700s, the Barbary corsairs might have enslaved, get this, 1 to 1.25 million Europeans.
1 million to 1.25 million.
Wow.
That's a huge number. It really changes how you might think about slavery in that era.
It does. And his method, it's interesting. He basically worked backwards, assuming a kind of roughly constant rate of capture over about 250 years.
Right, so it's an extrapolation.
Exactly. It prompts the question, even if we debate the exact figure, what does that kind of sustained activity tell us about just how big a problem this was?
That's a key point. And we should definitely mention not all historians are fully on board with those very high numbers.
No, there's debate.
John Wright, for example, he points out that a lot of modern estimates are, as he puts it, back calculations, which, brings in some uncertainty given the records from that time.
Which is fair. I mean, historical research, especially from centuries ago, dealing with, let's face it, populations often considered marginal by the big European powers.
Yeah.
Getting solid stats is incredibly tough. You're piecing together fragments, making informed guesses.
But okay, even if the total number is debated, the evidence for specific, large-scale, brutal raids, that's undeniable, right?
Oh, absolutely. We have some really harrowing examples.
Like in 1544, Herod and Barbarossa, he's a massive figure here.
Huge. One of the key architects.
He captured the island of Ischia, took something like 4,000 prisoners,
Yeah.
and from Lipari, in the same campaign, maybe 2,000 to 7,000 enslaved. These weren't small raids.
No, these were major operations designed to seize people. And it wasn't just Barbarossa. Think about Dragut, another big name.
Right, Dragut.
In 1551, he did something even more devastating. He enslaved the entire population of Gozo, the Maltese island.
The entire population.
Pretty much. We're talking 5, maybe 6,000 people. Just gone. Imagine the impact on that community. Just wiped out.
That's chilling.
Yeah.
And he wasn't done, was he?
No. 1554, he sacks Vieste in southern Italy. Reports say 5,000 inhabitants beheaded, another 6,000 abducted into slavery.
The scale of violence in just one raid,
Mm-hmm.
it's almost hard to comprehend today.
And if you place these in the context of the 16th century Med, they weren't isolated. 1558, the Balearic Islands invaded, 4,000 taken.
Yeah.
Later, 1618, Algerian pirates hit the Canary Islands, grab another 1,000 captives. It shows the reach, the sustained pressure over a huge area.
And the impact reached beyond the Med, too. You mentioned Baltimore and Ireland.
Yeah, the 1631 raid basically led to the settlement being abandoned for years.
Wow.
And just look at shipping losses. Between 1609 and 1616 alone, England reportedly lost 466 merchant ships.
466 in just 7 years.
Yeah. It shows this was a systemic threat, not just occasional piracy.
So what was the main goal here? Was it just loot or?
Well, cargo was valuable, sure. But the primary objective, really, was capturing non-Muslims.
Okay.
Either to sell them in the slave markets or sometimes to hold them for ransom if they were important enough.
Like Miguel de Cervantes, the author.
Exactly. He was held for nearly 5 years. His case really puts a human face on it. It wasn't purely economic. Religion and politics were deeply tied in.
And what about conversion? If someone converted to Islam?
Generally, yes, conversion meant freedom from slavery itself because enslaving fellow Muslims was forbidden.
But there's always a but, isn't there?
Right. But that freedom often meant they couldn't go back home. They couldn't return to their Christian families or lands. So it's a complex picture, freedom, but also assimilation, maybe coercion.
And just for broader context, this wasn't the only slave trade involving the Ottomans, right?
Not at all. It's worth remembering the huge number of slaves brought into Istanbul from the Black Sea region, the Crimean slave trade. Some estimates are around 2.5 million people between, say, 1450 and 1700. So the Barbary trade, while massive and devastating for those involved, was part of a much bigger picture of slavery in that part of the world.
Okay, so how did this eventually decline?
It really starts as European powers and the new United States begin to challenge the Barbary states militarily.
The Barbary Wars.
Exactly. Sweden and the U.S. were key players in those conflicts in the early 19th century.
There was that U.S. Navy expedition to Tripoli in 1804.
Yeah, under Commodore Preble, a big moment showing a new willingness to use force to protect their interests and citizens. A definite shift in approach.
But diplomacy was tried too, though sometimes with awful results.
True. There's that story of a British mission to Algiers securing the release of some Sardinian slaves.
Yeah.
Only for the Day of Algiers to reportedly have them massacred as soon as the British ships left.
No, that's horrific.
It led directly to a joint Anglo-Dutch fleet bombarding Algiers in 1816.
Yeah.
That forced another promise to end Christian slavery.
Another promise, implying the first ones didn't stick.
Pretty much. The practice continued, though maybe on a lesser scale.
So what really ended it?
Ultimately, it was sustained military pressure combined with major political shifts. The French conquest of Algeria, starting in 1830 and going on for decades.
Right.
And later, their control over Tunis, plus Ottoman, and then Italian control over Tripoli. That fundamentally changed the game.
So new European powers in charge meant new laws.
Exactly. Under European administration, laws were passed that suppressed and finally abolished the trade in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Morocco's Sultan had also acted earlier to curb piracy from his end.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. How did this all get started? How did it rise to such prominence? You mentioned piracy goes way back in North Africa.
It does, ancient roots even back to Roman times. But it really gained political muscle in the 16th century. Figures like Herod and Barbarossa were crucial.
We mentioned him before.
Yeah, he basically united Algeria and Tunisia under the Ottoman umbrella, and importantly, piracy heavily funded his state-building efforts.
So piracy was baked into the political economy right from the start.
Very much so. And other factors fueled it too, like the arrival of Moorish groups in places like Rabat and Tetuan in Morocco around 1609 after being kicked out of Spain.
They set up new pirate bases.
Essentially, yeah. And the Moroccan sultans who came to power saw the money in it and encouraged it as state revenue.
And then in the 17th century, the pirates started working together more.
Right, Algerian and Tunisian corsairs coordinating. By the mid-1600s, you had that figure of over 30,000 captives just in Algiers. It shows how organized it became.
And there were already slave markets there. It wasn't a new thing.
No, the infrastructure was there. Slave markets existed along that coast since Roman times, through the medieval period. The Barbary trade just massively scaled it up.
And the Ottomans arriving in the 15th century, that was a big turning point.
Definitely. Ottoman power provided a sort of umbrella. Plus, you had the influx of Sephardi Jews and Moorish refugees from Spain after the Reconquista.
Bringing skills and maybe some resentment towards Christian Europe.
Plausibly, yes. Maritime skills, local knowledge, maybe grievances. combined with Ottoman protection, even if it was sometimes loose, and a lot of displaced, poor immigrants looking for a way to survive.
It created a perfect storm for piracy.
Pretty much. Capturing crews and passengers became a brutal but viable living.
What about these renegades? Europeans who converted.
Yeah, that's a fascinating aspect. Christian Europeans who converted to Islam between maybe 1580 and 1680, estimates suggest around 15,000 of them in the Barbary states.
15,000. And they were involved in the piracy.
Oh, yeah. Significantly, maybe half the Corsair captains were renegades. Some were former slaves who converted and rose up. Others were adventurers, fortune seekers.
Their knowledge of Europe must have been useful.
Invaluable, you'd imagine, knowing ship types, tactics, coastlines.
And then there was a power shift within the Barbary states themselves.
Right, mid-17th century. A revolt weakened the official Ottoman governors, the pashas. They became more like figureheads.
Which gave the local rulers and the pirates more freedom.
Exactly. Tripoli, Algiers, Tunis became more autonomous, and the Corsairs gained even more influence, operating with less direct oversight from Istanbul.
So these raids, driven by capturing people, they hit the Atlantic coast of Africa too, not just Europe.
Yeah, and continued hammering European coasts deep into the early 19th century. Which brings us back to that huge contested estimate from Robert Davis, 1 to 1.25 million Europeans over that long period. It underscores the sheer duration and scope.
Right. Even if the numbers debated, the frequency and impact aren't.
No, the historical records across Europe, first-hand accounts, official reports, they paint a vivid picture of the terror.
Samuel Pepys mentioned in his diary, right, the threat to English ships.
He did. Shows it was a known danger even at high levels. And then you have the sack of Baltimore in Ireland, 1631, led by a Dutch renegade, Jan Zoon van Haarlem.
Also known as Murad Rees the Younger.
That's him. Basically carried off almost everyone into slavery. A stark reminder that even fairly remote places weren't safe.
And Jan Zoon. He got around, didn't he? Iceland.
Yeah, the 1627 raid on Iceland. Killed about 50, captured nearly 400, sold them in Algiers. It's mind-boggling that pirates from North Africa could hit Iceland. Shows their naval capability.
And the constant pressure on Mediterranean coasts. Venice and Malaga, you said it led to depopulation?
Absolutely. People fled inland. Coastal settlement was discouraged. There are accounts saying in some areas there was no one left to capture. Just devastating long-term effects.
And the Soleil rovers from Morocco, they set up a base in England.
Well, on Lundy Island in the Bristol Channel.
Yeah.
For 5 years, starting in 1627.
Wow.
Under Jan Zoon again. Flew an Ottoman flag there, used it to raid England and Ireland, held captives before shipping them to Algiers. The sheer audacity is something else.
And their power was such that even nations like the U.S. paid them off.
Yeah, paid tribute in the late 18th, early 19th century just to try and stop the attacks on their ships and sailors.
Yeah.
A huge issue in early American foreign policy.
We also have personal stories like Thomas Pellow.
Right, an English boy captured aged 11 in 1716, spent 21 years as a slave in Morocco.
21 years.
Finally escaped, wrote a memoir, gives a harrowing personal view of what life was like for the enslaved.
Okay, let's maybe break this down a bit by who is affected. Different nations had different experiences.
Definitely. As we said, this was one of the two main routes for European slaves into the Ottoman world, the other being the Crimean trade in the east.
Right.
So different countries faced different levels of threat, sea versus land raids, and had different ways of trying to deal with it, like ransom or fighting back.
So Britain and Ireland,
Yeah.
mostly sea attacks, but also land raids.
Yeah, shipping was the main target, but places like Cornwall, Devon, Southern Ireland saw coastal raids. Baltimore in 1631 was the biggest in Ireland.
But not the only one.
No, places like Dungarvan got hit too, maybe 50 people taken there. The English government did try to ransom people, sometimes held national collections for funds.
And ransoming women cost more.
Records suggest so, yeah. Significantly more sometimes.
And we know names. Helen Gloag, Elizabeth Marsh, Thomas Pellow.
Right. Their stories give us glimpses, often tragic ones, into the captives' lives and varied fates.
What about Denmark, Norway?
They also got hit at sea and on land. The Faroe Islands were particularly vulnerable. Raids in 1607 and a bad one in 1629 on Suðuroy, 30 people taken, never returned.
And this contributed to a war.
Yeah, the Danish-Algerian War in the 1770s was partly fueled by this ongoing piracy. Hark Olufs is a known captive from that region.
France had a slightly different situation because of their alliance with the Ottomans.
Theoretically, yes. The Franco-Ottoman alliance was meant to offer protection. The sultans officially told the corsairs to leave French ships alone.
But
But the Barbary states often did their own thing, so despite the alliance, French regions like Provence and Languedoc still got raided, especially mid-16th century. France complained. Sultan Suleiman issued an order in 1565.
Didn't fully work, though.
Had limited effect, seems like. There was still a raid near Calais in 1620. People like Anton Courtier were among the French captives. Diplomacy had its limits.
Iceland, we mentioned the Turkish abductions of 1627.
Devastating. Around 400 captured, maybe only 50 ever made it back, some after nearly 2 decades.
And Olafur Eagleson wrote about it.
Yeah, his account is incredibly powerful, a direct testimony from a very unexpected place.
Okay, Italy. You said Italy and Spain got hit hardest.
Arguably, yes, especially coastal raids. Frequent, devastating all through the 16th and 17th centuries.
Why Italy so much?
Political fragmentation, weaker coastal defenses in many areas made it vulnerable. The raids literally depopulated stretches of coastline. People fled.
That 1534 raid by Barbarossa in southern Italy sounds horrific.
It was. Towns ravaged, thousands killed or enslaved. Santa Lucido, Picciata, Sperlonga, over 1,000 enslaved from each.
Yeah.
They even tried to kidnap Giulia Gonzaga for the Sultan.
And the later raids, Ischia, Lipari, Gozo, Vieste, the numbers are staggering.
Absolutely. 1544, Ischia and Lipari, thousands taken. 1551, Gozo's entire population. 1554, Vieste, 7,000 slaves. These were demographic catastrophes.
And it just kept going.
Relentlessly. Bastia and Corsica, 1555, 6,000 prisoners. Ciutadella, 1558, 3,000 enslaved. Even near Sardinia in 1798, over 900 taken. The long-term impact was immense.
Did they try to get people back? Ransoms?
Wealthy families, the Venetian Senate, yes. They used merchants as go-betweens, but the overall damage to population, economy, huge. Martha Franceschini, Felicia Caroni are named victims.
Malta, too, particularly Gozo in 1551.
Yes. That joint Ottoman raid under Turgut and Sinan Pasha basically emptied Gozo, shows even fortified islands were at risk.
The Netherlands. No coastal raids, but ships were hit.
Exactly. Dutch merchant ships were frequent targets at sea, and the Dutch government was pretty active in ransoming citizens, often paying higher prices than others, maybe reflecting their big maritime interests.
Portugal.
Coastal raids there too, though maybe not quite as intense as Spain or Italy. Madeira was sacked in 1617, about 1,200 inhabitants reportedly abducted.
And Spain, again, one of the worst affected.
Definitely. Ship attacks, coastal raids from the early 1500s on. Tunis focused more east. Algiers and Morocco hit Spain and Western Europe hard.
Like Calera in 1550.
Yeah, Dragut took most of the townspeople. The 17th century saw really severe raids, depopulating villages. Calpe in 1637, 315 women and children taken.
Huge economic cost, too, for defenses.
Massive. Higher taxes for fortifications. And it even hurt naval recruitment because so many sailors were captured. Just like Italy, huge damage to population and economy.
What about Scandinavia? Sweden and Finland?
No coastal raids that far north, but their ships were targets out at sea, outside Western Europe, or in the Med.
We have records of enslaved Swedes.
Yes, like that 1662 appeal from 8 sailors in Algiers. And Sparfwinfelt meeting and recording names of Swedish slaves in 1691 gives it a real human dimension.
So how does Sweden deal with it?
Various ways. Insurance, naval convoys, treaties with the Barbary states, diplomacy for releases, and families tried desperately to raise ransoms.
Even poor families.
Yeah, collections in churches. There's the story of Maria Olsdottir working to ransom her husband. Most captives were sailors. Estimates are maybe 500 to 1,000 Swedes enslaved between 1650 and 1763. Marcus Berg is another known name.
And finally, British North America, the early U.S. No land raids.
No, but after the Revolutionary War, without British protection, American ships became targets. Sailors were enslaved.
Even before independence.
Massachusetts commerce felt it earlier, yes.
Morocco recognized the U.S. early, though.
They did, signed a treaty. But Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli started seizing U.S. ships from the 1780s.
And the U.S. paid tribute initially.
Yeah, lacking a strong navy, they paid protection money.
Which got expensive.
Very. A significant chunk of the national budget. That situation was unsustainable, really pushed the creation of the U.S. Navy in 1794 and led directly to the Barbary Wars.
Okay, so circling back to the decline, the Barbary Wars were key.
Absolutely. The U.S., often with European allies, won victories in the First and Second Barbary Wars early 19th century. That started to curb the activity.
And the 1816 bombardment of Algiers.
The Anglo-Dutch one, yeah. Forced the release of about 1,200 slaves and got that promise from the day to stop enslaving Christians.
But it didn't entirely stop then.
Apparently not. Slaving continued, leading to another British bombardment in 1824.
So the real end came with colonization.
Largely, yes. The French conquest of Algeria from 1830 onwards, and later Tunis, Ottoman Italian control in Tripoli. These new European powers dismantled the old system, brought in new laws. That finally ended the trade.
And the word razzia comes from this.
Yeah, originally from Maghrebi Arabic, specifically referring to these kinds of slave raids by the Barbary pirates, a linguistic echo of the era.
So wrapping this up, it's clear the Barbary slave trade was, well, huge. A really significant, brutal reality for centuries,
Yeah.
affecting so many Europeans, even early Americans.
Absolutely. The scale, the duration.
Okay.
It's a part of history, especially the European enslavement aspect, that maybe isn't as widely known as, say, the transatlantic trade.
Yeah, it definitely offers a different perspective on slavery and power dynamics in history.
It really does. And when you think about all those individual experiences, the sailors, the villagers, the children from so many different nations caught up in this, it makes you wonder, doesn't it? What does this whole history tell us about power, about identity, religious, national, and just about human resilience, often desperate resilience, facing that kind of threat in the Mediterranean back then?
That's a powerful thought to leave our listeners with. Thinking about those individual stories within this huge, complex, and often brutal historical picture.